Hi, Dave Scotland for cgswot.com, and welcome to another tutorial. Today we're going to take a look at a little bit of a matte painting exercise, and it's probably closely aligned to motion graphics rather than matte painting, but certainly the end effect is a very sort of a matte painting oriented sort of feel. And this is the end effect that we're going to be going for, and what you're looking at there are individual mountain elements and sort of a foreground character element and a sky element, all sort of positioned out in 3D space in After Effects, and a little bit of camera movement, and you can get quite a cinematic feel to this. Now, what I've deliberately gone for is a very simplistic design element or design side of the project, in that you should be able to replicate or pretty much do your own design to follow along with this particular tutorial. And when I say that, I'll show you exactly what goes into this design in Photoshop here. So basically, if I just hide these other layers, we've got a sky element there, and then we build up from the back to the front the mountain elements that are going to go in to the shot. Now, bear in mind that I have the original matte painting that I did here. I've cleaned a lot of the effects that were placed into the original. I've cleaned them out so that we can use these layers in this particular tutorial. So bear in mind that we will be doing some treatment to these mountain layers to bring them out. At the moment, it just looks like there's one sort of mountain layer there, but as we move forward, it'll become apparent as to why we've sort of left those effects out in Photoshop. So very simple. I'll give you a quick idea of how I did it. I just grabbed a very rough brush and did a horizon line, and then basically filled the rest of the layer below that line in with a solid black. And so basically I've just gone for rugged, almost alien type cliff face, but you can certainly go for any look you want. You could use sand dune type shapes. It's completely up to you. So let's go ahead now and jump into After Effects. And basically this is a blank After Effects palette and project. So what we'll do is just import. I'm just going to double click on the project window here, and I'm going to import that file, that Photoshop file. Now, by default, you'll find that your import kind settings is probably defaulted to composition crop layers. Now, we don't actually want that. We don't want the composition to be cropped around the individual layers. We want the composition every layer in the composition to maintain the overall resolution of the piece, so that every layer has the same resolution. It just makes life a bit harder for this particular tutorial if we don't do that. So merge layer styles is fine because there are no layer styles in the actual Photoshop file. So just composition is fine, and bring that in. And what happens is it brings the layers in, puts them in a folder, and it also creates a composition with the name of the file. Now let's go ahead and rename that. We'll call this master comp, and we'll have a quick look at it. We'll double click on it and bring up the timeline down the bottom here, and I might just leave that open there. And if we have a look, we'll zoom out a little bit and switch all of our visibilities on. There's our composition, looking exactly the same as it did in Photoshop. So, as I mentioned before, we need to do a little bit of treatment to these mountain layers just to sort of bring them out in the scene. And what I mean by that is we'll just grab this Mountain 05 layer, which is, I might just highlight the bottom layer, hit enter, and just name this Sky. It makes it a little bit easier. To identify in the stack there. Now, Mountain 5 is the mountain range that is furthest from camera here, and the one closest to the sky. And what we want to do is put an effect on it, So we'll just highlight it, right click on the effects panel here, and we'll put a generate ramp, and straight away we get a black and white gradient ramp there. What I'm going to do is just drag the black marker down until it's just above that horizon, and I'll use the shift key as I was dragging there just to maintain that it stayed on that center line, and then we'll drag the white up slightly. But what we're going to do is just unhide this Mountain 04, or isolate it as well, so that we can see how our gradient's working behind it. So we can see now that we need to drag that white one down. I'm going to change the color swatch for the white one to some sort of color that's in the sky here. Just go for something like that. Not the brightest color and not the darkest color. Somewhere in the middle is probably okay. And we'll just ramp up the ramp scatter a little bit. Kick that up to about 50. And that seems to be working nicely. I'm just going to drag this out of the road a little bit, just so that we can give ourselves a little bit more resolution. And that's really brought that far mountain range out in the image. So what we can do now is grab that ramp in the Mountain 05 layer, grab the ramp, Control C to copy, Mountain 04, Control V. So we've just pasted the same effect onto this Mountain 04. Let's go ahead and unhide or isolate Mountain 03 as well, so that we can see how the gradient's working. And I might just hide the Mountain 05 and the sky, just so we can really tell what we're working with here. So the Mountain 04 looks like we can bring the black down on it a little bit. I might just unhide the sky, come in here a little bit, and probably bring the black just down a little bit, and it gives it that contrast. You can see it along the edge there where it's picking up the ramp from the Mountain 05 layer. But it looks like we could probably bring our lighter color up, not too much, and then just bring the black down slightly, and that's giving us a nice sort of fall off there and silhouetting the Mountain 03 in front of it as well nicely. So let's select Mountain 03, Control V, and copy that ramp in again, and we'll realign the black, just bring it down slightly. You see, by doing that we're getting a nicer silhouette along the top. And we'll just unhide Mountain 02 to make sure that we're getting a nice effect. Bring the lighter color down. We're going for subtlety on this effect, and I think that's probably there's probably going to do the job. Now we'll go with Mountain 02, Control V, and we'll just bring the black down to about here, and then drop the lighter color right down quite low. We'll unhide the foreground mountain just to see how that's working, and we're getting a nice effect there. We could probably bring the lighter color up a little bit, just given that we're probably not going to be zooming in on this particular bottom right section of the composition. We'll probably be starting up on the horizon line up here a little bit more. So just make sure that those gradients are working before you start, and you should get something like that, just some very faint fall off of that lighter color on each mountain range there. And I guess we could maybe go for, we'll grab the foreground mountain, Control V, and we'll do a little bit of adjustment here, something up in there, and then drag this right out down low. And that's just going to give us a very small amount of fall off on that foreground element, the cliff with the character on. So that's worked nicely. What we'll do now is move on to distributing these layers in 3D space. And the first thing we need to do is create a camera. So if we go up to our layer, new camera, and we're just going to set a 35mm camera for now. We'll go OK. Go OK to that. And that little error was basically telling us that there's no 3D layers in the scene. So that's a good reminder. Let's switch all of our layers to 3D. And so now they're 3D layers in our scene, but they're all sharing the same Z space. They're all at the same level, and we need to now basically lay out our scene to sort of follow a little bit of believable distancing. And what I mean by that is I'm just going to switch to a 2-view horizontal, and on the right hand side is basically what the camera is seeing, and on the left hand side is a top view. So we're going to highlight our sky layer, and we're going to push that sky layer back in Z space, and what we're going to do is try to come out. You'll find that you will only be able to zoom out in top view to a certain amount, and once you've reached that, now we know how far back we can actually push this thing without it going off the screen. Once it goes off the screen, it's very hard to grab in a top view. You then have to use the, if I bring up P here, you then have to use the Z numbers to actually move it around, and we want to keep it in the screen here. So just maximize, come out as far as you can in that top view and push that sky back as far as you can in the view. So now that we've done that, on the right hand side what we can do is scale using the shift key to maintain the resolution. Scale that up. This is the sky element. Scale it up just slightly bigger, just to be sure. You don't want any cropped edges when we do start to move this camera around. So I've just gone just a couple of pixels bigger, and that's going to work nicely. So you'll see in the top view here that we have our sky element way back here, and it's actually quite large now, and we've got our camera right down here in the bottom of the scene. So we can go for our mountain 5 layer now, highlight it and push it back in Z depth until it's actually quite close to the sky, but not right on top of it. About that distance there should be fine. And then in the right view here, do the same process as before, scale it up and just use your shift key to maintain the resolution, and just make it just slightly bigger than the composition, and that should be fine. And so that's our Mountain 05 back there now. Let's go with Mountain 04, same process, just in the Z. We're going to push it back, and this time we're going to come forward a little bit and leave a bit of distance between these two mountains. That's just going to give us some different parallaxing as we move the camera in the 3D space. We want a slightly different rate of movement of the elements, and the best way to do that is to sort of stagger the distances as we go back in 3D space here. So Mountain 03 will do the same, only this time we're going to push it a little bit closer and closer to the previous mountain, and then we're just going to, on the right view here, same as before, we're just going to slide it up and make sure that it's the right resolution here. And then we'll go with our Mountain 02, make sure that it's selected there, and push it back in Z space. Only this time I'm going to go a little bit back, keep it a little bit closer to the camera, and on the right hand side make sure you scale it up. And then our foreground element, we're actually going to keep the foreground element where it is at 0 on the Z depth. So the Z setting is 0, so it's pretty much center of the 3D After Effects universe here. Okay, so that's pretty much it for I'm just going to go back to a single view, and now if I rotate this camera, select the camera there and just go into my orbit tool, you'll see that we're going to get some parallaxing of the elements, and we're now working in 3D space there. So I'll just undo that, and that brings us to our camera animation. We want to get that locked in so that we have a good idea of how the elements sit in the scene. Now, just before we do the camera animation, what I'm actually going to do is use a light, and I'm not going to use any of the light properties. I'm just going to use the light as a position object, so that we can basically use some scripts or some expressions to tie some of our lighting effect elements to that space, or to that positional data, and that'll become apparent as we move forward. So just go ahead and go Layer, New, Light, click OK to that, and that light, what we want that light to do, if I just go to a top view, we want that light to basically be as close to that sky layer as we can, and we can do that by just bringing up the position of the sky layer. Just hit P, take that Z number and Control C. So we're just copying the Z number, and then in the light we hit P and we're going to paste that number in. And what that does is puts the light right back here on the on that plane, and that's exactly what we want. Now if we go back to our camera view, and I'll just zoom in to fit here, you'll notice everything's black in the scene, and that's because the light is trying to light the layers, given that they're 3D layers, and the light is way off in the background there, so it's not actually lighting the surface of these layers. Now we don't want the light to light the layers, so if we select all of the layers, then any one of them, with them all selected, we just toggle down and go into the material options and switch off accepts lights. Just switch that to off, and everything pops back onto the screen, and then we can wind the arrows back up, and as long as they're all selected, that effect, the change you just made, will basically affect all of the layers. So that light is now not affecting any of the surfaces in the scene, which is what we want. Now with the light, what we want to do is line it up. Now we know that in Z depth it's exactly where it needs to be. So what we're going to do now is drag it across. I might just switch to a lower resolution here for now. I'm just going to drag that light across and line it up with our sun, which is right on the horizon there. I'll come in a little bit. Now we don't want the light to be we don't want the light to be too close to the horizon, because of some of the effects we're going to use. We don't want it to drop with our camera movement. We don't want it to drop below the horizon, so just above the horizon there is fine. We'll come back out now, so our light is in place. Okay, now before we move on to the camera animation, I think it's a little bit easier to do some of these lighting effects before we do our camera movement. And the first lighting effect I want to do is I want to put a little bit of light rays sort of coming from the ridge line of that far mountain, the mountain 05. So what I'm going to do to achieve that is I'm just going to go Control D on the mountain 05, which gives me two layers down here, and I want to select the new layer that's been created, which is mountain 06, and I'm just going to go Layer, New, Solid. We'll leave it white and make it comp size. We'll go OK to that. We're going to move that down underneath mountain 06. Then we're going to use mountain 06 as a track matte. And basically what that does, if I isolate that, is it just gives us a white version of that far mountain. And now I'm just going to select both of those layers, the white solid and the mountain 06, and I'm going to pre-comp that. I'm just going to layer, pre-compose, move all attributes is fine, and then open new composition. Now we'll call this mountain ridge far, and we'll go OK to that. Now what we've got there is, notice our mountain 06 is in 3D space, and it's in the correct position where it should be in the shot. So what we can do now, and I'll just double check that, hit P, and provided that Z number is quite large, it's more than likely to be exactly where it needs to be, and we can always check that when we come back into our main comp. So I'm going to grab both those layers. I'm going to go Control D to duplicate them, but on the top solid I'm going to go layer solid settings, and I'm just going to change it to black. I'm just going to go OK to that, and what that does is gives a very fine rim line that we're going to accentuate a little bit here. If we go to the top Mountain 07 and just go into our effects layer, we can get rid of the ramp. We don't need the ramp in this scene, and same with the Mountain 06, just get rid of that. And in the Mountain 07 we're going to introduce a matte simple choker, and if we push that number up we can get more of a ridge line there, and that's what we want. Now with the Mountain 06 solid down the bottom, the one right down the bottom, we're going to create a mask, an elliptical mask. So just grab your ellipse tool and just draw a mask around, roughly around that area where the sun is, and we can come back into our master comp and we can get a good idea of where that is falling there. So what we can do, notice it's a little bit out of whack given where our sun is here, and that's because we need to switch on the collapse transforms toggle. If we switch that on, it'll pop back to exactly where it needs to be in 3D space. And make sure that this layer back in the main comp is not a 3D layer. We're taking by using the collapse transforms, we're taking the 3D information from the pre-comp, the Mountain Ridge Far pre-comp. So that's pretty close there. We could probably move our mask across a little bit. I'm just going to use the path Control T. I'm just going to move it across a little bit, and I'm just going to feather it as well. Just put a bit of a feather on it, and that's going to work nicely. We'll go OK to that. And so we have this feathered sort of highlight area across the top there. And with that Mountain Ridge Far selected, we're going to add a Trapcode Shine effect. Now you could always go for a motion blur. You could certainly, like, I can delete that shine, I'll just highlight this Mountain Ridge. We could certainly go for a blur, radial blur, switch it to zoom, and then move the zoom point to something that represents that sun up there. We move it down a little bit lower. We'd actually physically move it in the viewport here over to that point, and blow it right out, and that's going to give us a similar effect to what we're going for. You can see the sun rays there, but I think you've got a little bit more control, and the effect is a little bit nicer with the Trapcode Shine plugin. So we're going to use Shine, and what we're going to do is do a little bit of scripting on the position of the source point. So if we Alt click on the source point, what we can actually do is introduce, I've got this script, a very handy script that basically and I'm just going to copy it in here. Basically what this script does, and this is in the source point of the shine effect, L equals this comp dot layer light 1, which is exactly the name of the light, and it's basically going to take, using the toComp command, it's going to take the X, Y, and Z value of that light, the light position, and this is very handy for using, for being able to put 3D data into a 2D parameter, which is, this light source is a 2D parameter, yet we're able to, through this script, is feed the 3D data into it. So that's you can see the shine on the horizon there, and we can boost the light and then really stretch out the rays, and that's going to work nicely. Now we can go into the colorize here, and I'm just going to go for one color, and I'm going to use the eye picker and just go for a color in that horizon, in that sky, and that's looking pretty good. Now what we can do now is grab that layer and move it up just in front of or behind the foreground element, and so therefore we get these light beams that are beaming right across the valley there. Now I don't really like what's happening up here on the horizon, and we can fix that. If I go back into this mountain ridge layer and switch off the simple choker, what we can actually do, instead of putting a simple choke on the top, I'm just going to delete it, and I'm going to put the choker on the bottom, on the Mountain 06. And I'll show you what that actually does. By putting the matte simple choke and winding it in the opposite direction, we're actually going beyond the original mask. And now if I come back into the master comp here, you'll see that I'm not getting that black edge along the mountain there. We've got a little bit less information, so I might have to just increase that choke a little bit more. That's looking pretty good, and that's just going to give us a little bit more shine. Now we are getting some staging in the gradient there, and that's simply because our project is 8 bits, and we're going to change that to 16 bits, but for now, for speed purposes, we're just going to leave that at 8 bits for now. Okay, so that's our mountain ridge far. What I want to do now is do the exact same process, except I want to do it on the foreground, and I want to have it more of a shadow layer. Now that'll make sense in a moment. Just highlight the foreground mountain, Control D to copy it, go Layer, New, Solid, switch it to white, comp size is OK, and just move that down underneath the copy of the foreground mountain that we just created. And what we want to do is grab both those layers, Layer, Pre-Compose, and we'll just call this, we'll call it foreground, foreground rim light is fine, and we'll open that in a new composition. And what we didn't do, that we can do now, is just set the alpha matte so that we have that as a white alpha matte there. Now same process as before. We want to grab both layers, Control D to duplicate, grab the top one, the top solid settings, and change that to black. And we'll go OK to that, and that gives us our little rim or edge line there. We'll go to the bottom one, get rid of the ramp. In fact, we can get rid of the ramp from the top as well. Go to the bottom one and introduce the matte simple choker, and just wind it into the negative. Something like that is fine. And then highlight the white solid at the bottom and draw out an ellipse mask just roughly around our character there, and then we'll give a little bit of a feather to that as well. And we'll come back into our master comp, and you can see there that we've got that ridge rim line there. And what we want to do is, with that highlighted, we're going to introduce a trap code shine again, and this time we're going to boost the light a little bit, and we're going to grab, first of all we'll alt click on the stopwatch on the source point, and we're just going to copy that expression in there again, and that means that the shine source point is going to be right where our sun is. And with the color, we're going to swap to a one color for shine, and then we're going to make it black. Now it's a bit harsh to start with, and then we're going to swap the layer mode from normal to multiply, and then we're just going to just reduce the boost light a little bit, and that's going to be fine for now. We're going to knock that back a little bit later, but you can see what we're getting there is this volumetric shadowing from the character, and that's going to become a lot more apparent as we introduce a little bit more lighting effects here. It's going to feel like she or he on the cliff there is actually blocking some of this sunbeams and causing that shadow effect there. Okay, for the camera animation, what you need to be aware of is that at the moment our composition, if I just go comp settings, is 1200 by 1650, which is the original composition size of the Photoshop file that we used. So we don't want to shoot in that resolution. It's just certainly not a standard camera resolution. What we want to do is change our composition size so that we physically see what the camera is going to capture. So we can do that with composition, comp settings, and we're going to change what you can do is set it for a high definition 1080. I'm going to swap the frame rate to 30. Comp settings again, bring those up, and then I'm just going to lock the aspect ratio and just drop down to something a little bit more practical for the tutorial, which is 720 by 405, but it's still the same resolution or ratio as the high definition shot. About 180 frames is fine for this tutorial. And straight away you'll see that we're sort of zoomed in on a section here because we're only seeing this resolution and the original elements are still out at their original size. So let's go for our first camera position, and you'll notice that the camera has two crucial position settings here. One is the point of interest and one is the position. Now the point of interest is basically the camera target, and if we go to a top view here, that camera target is right here at 0, and you can see here that it's set to 0. If we wind it forward or wind it up, then it'll move further away from the camera. What we want to do is move it. I'll zoom out a little bit more. We want to move that right out to slightly beyond our sky, and the animation that we're going to be using for the camera is just camera animation, not point of interest. We may put a little bit of subtle movement on the point of interest, and that can help with the dynamic, and we'll probably touch on that as we move forward. But let's move our camera position. First, let's set a keyframe at frame 0 for both of those settings, point of interest and position. And what we're going to do is set up our opening position for the camera. So I'm just going to come back in Z space with the camera and position this camera just using the sliders here. If I go and grab that camera and start moving it around, the point of interest is going to move with it, and we don't want that. So I'm just going to line up my character sort of over just slightly to the left there. That's probably going to be okay. And then I'm just going to move it down a little bit, slightly below the horizon line, and this is where we're going to use our numbers here by animating the point of interest just down. We want to frame up that far ridge line with basically our top third compositional sort of rule of thirds. We want it right up at the top there, on that top third line, and we want our character to be just below it in our starting frame, so that they become a little bit more obvious as we move in, and the viewer will sort of pick up on that positioning. So that's pretty close to where we want our opening shot there, and then we can go through to the last frame and reposition our camera again. This time we're going to zoom in, come in a little bit closer. Notice we're just animating the camera, not the point of interest. We're going to slide up slightly, and we're going to slide across. And what we want is the character to be very close to that sun, but not to basically block the sun. And that's probably it. We'll go a little bit higher, given that we're just going to come down a little bit on our source or point of interest. Just going to come across now. Something like that is fine, and we're just going to check that and see how that's working. Now that's reading as a fairly static sort of zoom in shot, and I didn't want to go for that. So let's really have a look at this point of interest here. Push it to the left. We're just animating the point of interest here, and then push the character in just a bit, about there. We might need to push the point of interest back a little bit more, but what we'll do is come back to our starting position, and then we're just going to push that point of interest. And we might push it out to the left quite a bit, and then we're just going to grab our foreground layers here, making sure you get both the pre-comp and the other layer, and we're just going to drag it back over to the left. Now when we come in here now, we can change our camera position to bring that character in to here, and now you'll see that we're getting a lot more dynamic movement with the camera. It sort of feels like it's arcing around, it's sort of rotating around a little bit and not so static in movement, and I think that's really going to work now. So the camera movement looks like it's fine there, and it's certainly something that you can play with for hours to really give you something that you like. But like we did just there, make sure that you're not too scared of moving elements around in the scene, provided your start and finish position for the camera doesn't cut off those elements. And I think this is going to work fine. Now there is one thing I do have to check. The sky layer actually has a sort of a mountain ridge shape cut into it, and I want to make sure that that is not visible. If I switch that on and off in the sky, and it looks fine, as long as that mountain 05 is blocking that sky all on its own, and not this blocked out element, because once I switch on the black, it could actually read as an extra mountain range, and we don't want that. It's going to give us some very funny effect with the sky parallax 3D effect here. Okay, so everything looks like it's working fine there. What we can do now is implement our overall, our sort of global lighting effect, which is a lens flare. I will be using the Knoll Light Factory lens flare, and the source location again, we just alt click and copy in that to give us the position. Now I'm just going to go into the options. We'll just make sure that use unmultiply, just get rid of that, and go into the options. And what we want to do, I'm going to get rid of the star filter, and the glow ball here, I'm just going to bring the ring brightness down a little bit. I'm going to change the color to something in that sort of orangey, peachy yellow, and that looks pretty good. We can go to the polysphere now, and we'll just crank those up a little bit. We'll change the color of those a little bit as well, and we spread them out a little bit more. That's probably going to work. And what I might do is just add another glow sphere or glow ball. Let's close that, and just change this to something a little bit hotter in color, something like that. And we just want to get rid of that ring brightness, ramp the scale down a little bit. It's just, we're looking for an inner glow here. Tapers doesn't matter. Ramp the gamma. I think that's going to work fine. We'll just go OK to that. Now the overall scale and brightness, we can bring the scale down a little bit, but then just ramp the brightness up slightly. Something like that is fine. That's going to work nicely. And so that effect is in place, and I think it's working okay. So now what we need to do is just fool the viewer into this sunset sunrise effect here. So what we're going to do is create a new solid. We'll make it white, and we might just rename it. We'll call it Sun Overlay. We'll go OK to that, and we're just going to move it down so that it's behind, on top of the pre-comp for the sunbeams, but below the foreground element. And then we're just going to use the ellipse tool. Just going to draw out something like that is fine, and just reposition it back up to where the sun is, and that's going to work nicely. We'll give it a nice fall off for the mask. You don't want to fall it off so much that it doesn't have a sort of a solid central area there. And now we're just going to change the mode to overlay, and I'll switch that on and off, and you'll see that it's really starting to sort of bump up the light value in that sun area there. And what we're going to do is control, well actually we need to make sure that our camera move is going to stay on track there. So let's bring up our mask settings again, hit a keyframe for frame 0, and then when we go through to the end, just move the mask and make sure that the mask maintains near that sun, and you'll see as we scrub that that's just going to work nicely. So now we can duplicate, Control D, and we'll just rename that to we'll go sun add, and we're going to change that to an add, or maybe let's try a screen. I think screen's going to work nicely, so we might as well rename that sun screen. And then we're just going to bring up T for opacity and wind that down a little bit, and that's going to work. We might even, we'll leave it up for a moment. We'll go into the mask setting, and we will Control T and just scale it. Or actually what we'll do is just go into those mask settings and reduce the feather slightly, and then expand it in slightly, and that means we're just going to get this sort of dual highlight effect, and I think that's going to work nicely there. And I really think that what we might need to do, I'm just not sure whether, you'll see at the moment the foreground element is blocking out those two layers that we've just put there, and you'll see if I move those up above, it starts to actually take over. So I'm definitely going to leave it down below. I think I might even put it below our rays of light there. Now speaking of those rays of light, now that we've got some camera movement in here, we want to make sure that they're visible. So I'm just going to hit that that mountain ridge far. I'm just going to crank up the boost light quite a bit, and then pay it out a little bit more, and that should be fine. And just check, see it's far too hot at the top here, so let's go ahead and reduce that boost light, or leave the boost light up but just increase the ray length. Just got to play with these settings a little bit, make sure that we're getting something that works. And the other thing that we could do, but be very careful with the effect, is select the sun, the light, and move it up just slightly, and you'll start to get a nicer effect with these light rays. So now we can sort of boost the light a little bit more. Okay, so the shot's looking pretty good now, and probably the only thing we need to do now is a little bit of color correction. So what we can do, we'll just rename this adjustment layer to lens flare, and we'll grab another adjustment layer, and we're going to drag that down on top of the sky, and we're going to add a color correction curves to that. And I just want to bring a little bit of contrast out in that sky. Just contrast it out a little bit, and I might even just put a blur sharpen, fast blur, repeat on edges, and just give it maybe a 2 on the blur, and that's going to just help sort of sell a bit of the distance involved with that sky element. And we'll just rename that sky curves, and then we might just put a global color correction adjustment layer over the top. We'll go with a color correction curves. We'll just contrast it a little bit more. Something like that is fine, and we might we'll try a color correction hue and saturation and see if we can just warm it up a little bit. We'll colorize and just change that hue to, and I don't really like what it's doing to the sky, and it's because the sky is probably not as high res as it should be for a shot like this, so bear that in mind when you do start to create your own elements in Photoshop. There you go for a sky that's got some really nice high res to it, because we're in actually quite close in this shot. We could have a look at the sky in terms of resolution, bearing in mind that frame 0 we're as far away from the sky that will ever be, and then we sort of seem to push in on it. We could go to that frame 0 and maybe just scale that sky in a little bit, not too much. Still want to maintain that edge. Just double check that our camera movement is not going to affect that, and that's going to work nicely. It's given us a little bit more detail on the sky now. I could probably, now that I've scaled it, probably just move it up a little bit. Just always bear in mind that there is a sort of a mask, a mountain shaped mask. You can see it start to appear there. Just bring it back down, and that's probably going to work nicely. And just check your starting and finishing camera angles there. It looks like our shadow shine from the character, which is this foreground rim light, could come down a little bit in opacity, so just hit T, just bring that down to something that's a little, we're going for subtlety here, something that's nice and subtle. I think it's going to work nicely, given that from frame 0 you really can't see it, and then it starts to appear as we move to our finishing position there. And probably the only other thing we could do is I'll just rename this to curves. What we could probably do is just put a layer, new, solid, a black solid, comp size is fine, we'll go OK to that, and then we're just going to add an effect of a transition linear wipe, and we're just going to just wipe this over to the right hand side, give it a nice big feather, something like that. We'll switch its layer mode to maybe a classic color burn. It's probably a little bit harsh, maybe just a linear burn. Now we'll go with that, we'll go with the classic color burn, and then hit T, just bring the opacity right down, just wind it in until we start to get a little bit of a vignette effect on the edge there. So from frame 0, it sort of brings out that orange in the sky on the right hand side and just sort of pushes you in to the scene a little bit. So it's similar to a vignette, except it's sort of a linear version of a vignette. Okay, so that's pretty much all we need now. I might as well quickly show you how we're going to kick that out to a render. So we just go add to render queue with the master comp selected, and output module. I really like the QuickTime Sorensen 3, which gives me good quality but a fairly low size for output. It's certainly not production output quality. And then just kick off a render there. Now actually before we do, I'll stop that and just get rid of the render in there. We're just going to swap our project. If I come in here and show you, I'll come in so we can see some of those light rays. In fact, where have our light rays gone? Oh, they're up. They're up a little higher. We may need to just affect these light rays a little bit more. let's go ahead and grab our light. Just going to push it a little bit to the left and just see if that's affecting the rest of the shot. I think that's going to work fine. So now we can just go into that effect and reduce the boost light quite a bit. It's going to work nicely. The colour is a little bit harsh. Just bring it out of the saturation area there. Increase the length a bit, and that's going to work fine. We'll just check our last. Yeah, I think that's going to work nicely. So what we can do now is, in our project window, we hold Alt and click on the 8 bits per channel, and we'll go to 16 bits, and we're going to get a much nicer fall off of all of our lighting effects there. So with the master comp selected, we'll go composition, add to Redner Q. I'm going to go for that QuickTime Sorensen 3, and just delete that last render and kick off a render. Now that's all we need for the actual shot. It was a very simple exercise to show you that you can get quite a cinematic feel and look with some very simple elements, and I strongly suggest that you jump into Photoshop and do yourself up one of these very basic matte painting projects where you're just literally doing silhouette work, and the lighting is very strong and heavy for this effect beyond that silhouette work, and that's how the silhouettes actually work as well as they do. So that's going to take an eternity to render. I'm just going to pause that and show you our end product again. You'll see that very quickly you can get some great results just by using some very simple elements. They're all static elements, and I strongly suggest that you give this a try and let your imagination run a little bit wild with the elements that you put together in Photoshop. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. Until next time, bye for now.